everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to be bringing you my wrap up for the BookTubeAthon 2018. If somehow you don't know what the BookTubeAthon is, it is an annual readathon hosted by Ariel Pizzette. It runs for 7 days every single year and there are a bunch of different reading challenges, and every year there is the overarching challenge to read 7 books in 7 days. And this year I did complete the BookTubeAthon. I did all of the challenges, so I'm really pleased about that. So yeah, I'm just going to get into telling you about the book. The first challenge was to let a coin toss decide which book you should read first, and for this I ended up reading The Lifted Veil by George Eliot. I've read a couple of George Eliot's novels in the past and I really loved them. If you've been on this channel for any amount of time, you'd know that I love Middlemarch. More on that in a minute. But this novella is quite different from any of George Eliot's other work. It was published the same year as her first novel and it is the only one of her works that features a first-person narrator, and it's also her only venture into like science fiction. Our first-person narrator is an unreliable one named Latimer, who believes he has the supernatural gift to see into the future and to be able to read people's minds. But he develops this sort of obsession about his brother's fiancée because he cannot read her. His brother ends up dying and then he marries her, but the marriage breaks down because he finds her untrustworthy and manipulative. After that, some of the supernatural science fiction-y elements start to come into it. And I won't spoil those for you, but I think they're really well done. And while this was quite different from any of George Eliot's other work that I've read, I can definitely see elements of the works that she would go on to write in this novella. So her interest in emerging contemporary science, and some of the characterization reminds me of some of the characters that will feature in her future novels. I really enjoyed this one. It was really great to see something a little bit different from George Eliot. And while it's not necessarily the subject matter of this novella, I found it quite amusing to see a man projecting onto a woman and not really understanding who she is and then being annoyed with her, even though he was just in love with the idea of her rather than her actual self. Following on quite nicely from that, the next challenge was to read a book about something that you would like to do. And for this, I decided to pick up a non-fiction book, and that is The Road to Middlemarch, My Life with George Eliot by Rebecca Mead. Rebecca Mead is a person who has quite a long-standing relationship with George Eliot's novel Middlemarch, and she rereads it every year, and that is the thing I would like to do. I wouldn't like to reread Middlemarch every single year, but you know, I would like to reread it at some point. This is part biography about George Eliot, it's part the author's memoir, it's also in part a love letter to Middlemarch as a novel, but just also literature in general and the power and impact that literature can have in someone's life. I learned so much about George Eliot's life from this book, and I would really, really recommend it if you are interested in her as a person. It probably goes without saying, but I would recommend reading some of George Eliot's fiction before you go into this, particularly Middlemarch, obviously, but also possibly The Mill on the Floss. Her other books are mentioned, but in nowhere near as much detail. What I will say is, while I definitely enjoyed the biographical elements about George Eliot's life, I did expect there to be a bit more about the writer's life in this and her relationship with Middlemarch. There's definitely still that stuff in there, but the balance was just slightly different than I anticipated. I found it really fascinating to see how her perspective on the novel changed as she got older, the different things she noticed each time she reread the book. If you're a fan of George Eliot, I would just really recommend this one. Next book I read fulfilled the challenge of wearing the same hat every time you read the book, and I actually listened to this one on audiobook. It was Juliet Takes a Breath by Gabby Rivera, and I had heard so many things about this book and it definitely lived up to my expectations. So this book is about 19-year-old Juliet who has just had her first year at college. She defines herself as a Puerto Rican gay woman, so that's already a perspective that I have not seen depicted in literature before, and there are so many different identities depicted in this book. It's very intersectional. The book opens with Juliet writing essentially a fan letter to one of her favourite writers. This writer is called Harlow Brisbane, and she is a very well-known feminist writer, and her book has had a profound impact on Juliet. As a result of this letter, the author offers Juliet an internship. So she leaves the Bronx and goes to Portland, Oregon for this internship, and essentially the book just follows on from there. Juliet goes along a quite significant learning curve in this book, and the reader is taken along that learning curve alongside her. She meets a lot of people who identify in ways that she doesn't quite understand at first. At points, all the different ways that the people she interacts with identify become slightly overwhelming, and there's a lot of terminology that she's not familiar with. But throughout the book, she's not only discovering more about her own identity, but she's also discovering how to be a better ally to people of other marginalized groups. I think this book did a fantastic job of showing what it's like to be a good ally and how you can be a good ally through patience and understanding, putting the effort in, apologizing when you do mess up. And through Juliet's relationship with Harlow, we also see a lot about how your heroes aren't always exactly as great as you expect them to be. I think this book is essential reading if you are interested in books that depict queer culture. The next book I read was, in contrast, extremely heterosexual. I fulfilled the challenge of reading a book and then watching its film adaptation, and for this I decided to read Bridget Jones' The Edge of Reason by Helen Fielding. I was considering reading Tess of the D'Urbervilles, but I just wouldn't have had time. I don't feel like I need to describe to anyone what Bridget Jones is about, but essentially we are following a woman in her late 20s. We are following her slightly bumbling through her career, her romantic relationships, her friendships. There are a lot of things in this book that aren't in the film, and I completely understand why those things were taken out of the film. Like, for instance, when Bridget's mother and her friend Una go to Africa and bring back a black man. That part of the novel was very strange. In saying that, Bridget's mother is like a lot of middle-class mothers that I have met in my life. Another part of this book, which obviously wouldn't have worked in the film, is when Bridget interviews Colin Firth, because obviously Colin Firth plays Mark Darcy in the film. And the storyline about Bridget getting arrested in Thailand is changed a little bit as well. Now I have only read the first 2 Bridget Jones books, but I have seen all of the films, and just based on that, I think that the second book, The Edge of Reason, this one, is probably the weakest one. In saying that, Mad About Boy wasn't turned into a film, so I don't know what happens in that one. But there was still so much in this book that I was like highlighting on my Kindle app. I really wish that I had a physical copy of this, because there was just so much in it that I just found so relatable, and that really sums up the Bridget Jones books, that they're relatable. Picador are bringing out a Picador Classics edition of this book that matches the Picador Classics edition of the first Bridget Jones book, and I would really love to get my hands on that, because I would love to go back and actually put sticky notes on the bits that I really loved. The next book I read fulfilled the challenge of reading a book with green on the cover, and I went for Herland by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. This is a utopian novel that was published in 1915, and it has a lot of feminist themes to it, but I have slightly mixed feelings on them. This is about 3 male characters that go on scientific expeditions to find uncharted parts of the globe, and they find Herland, which is an island entirely populated by women. Obviously, at first they find this entirely baffling, and learning more about the cultures and the society of this island really makes them reconsider their own beliefs about humanity. I found the satirical and quite sarcastic elements of this novel really entertaining. So when the women on this island begin to dissect things that the men tell them about like Western society, when they highlight how strange things are to someone that hasn't been immersed in those kind of cultural norms. So while I really enjoyed those elements, there were parts of it that I found very strange. The women that inhabit this island come across as quite robotic, and there's almost this sort of hive mind kind of vibe about this book. Also, they are obsessed with motherhood. In saying that, their definitions of motherhood is slightly different to what the definition of motherhood is from the perspective of the 3 male characters, but they are still obsessed with it. I did find it quite strange. In saying all of that, I do still think it would be a really valuable read if you are interested in science fiction, particularly the feminist history of science fiction, but I'm just not quite sure how well this story has aged. The next book I read fulfilled the challenge of reading a book with a beautiful spine, and the book I read for this challenge was Rebel of the Sands by Alwyn Hamilton. It's got a pretty beautiful spine. I will preface my thoughts with, is that I don't think this book was really for me, but I can appreciate how good it actually is, and I understand why so many people have loved this book. In this book we follow our protagonist Amani, who lives in a desert world where it's quite patriarchal, and everything that she owns is actually owned by a male authority figure in her life. She decides to take her fate into her own hands as she disguises herself as a boy and she enters a gun shooting competition. Things happen and she finds herself on the run with this guy and a part of a rebellion. I am not into rebellion, adventure, battle-y books, but if you are, I think you would really love this book. What I thought was really cool about it was that our protagonist wasn't just inexplicably strong. She had a genuine talent in shooting that she had worked on. There is a bit of Arabian mythology in this book, and I cannot speak to how well that is incorporated and blended with the sort of wild western elements of this book, because I don't know enough about either of those things. If you are into YA adventure stories with a female protagonist, then I really think you would enjoy this book, but it just wasn't really my cup of tea, and I probably won't be carrying on with the trilogy. And my final and 7th book that I read for the BookTubeAthon was You Found a Beating Heart by Nisha Baku, and this is a poetry collection published by the Onslaught Press. These are quite uncanny, experimental feminist poems, and I think a lot of them come from the poet's experiences of lucid dreaming, which isn't something that I can really relate to. A lot of the poems were really quite strange and I found them slightly hard to get to grips with, but the ones that I did enjoy I really, really loved, and I really loved the lyricism and the use of sound in this poetry collection. They've all got a fantastic rhythm to them, and it reflects the idea of there being a beating heart. They are very experimental, and I found myself connecting with specific lines rather than specific poems. But some of the poems that I did particularly enjoy, there's one called High towards the end that I thought was really fantastic, and then the other one that I really enjoyed was called Given, which is only a 4-line poem, and it reads, "Perhaps we were only given 4 hours, and no way to avert the hot sting of ringing. When I put my ear to the scar on your chest, I listened for intimacy, but heard ticking." They are very confessional, they are at times somewhat elusive, but I did really enjoy the poems in this collection. So that is it. That's what I read for the BookTubeAthon. Let me know down below how you got on with the BookTubeAthon. I know I'm mentioning it in like every single video, but I am raising money for the Alzheimer's Society this month, so if you want to donate to that, you can follow the link in the description. Also, if you use any of my affiliate links to buy yourself some books, I will be donating all of the money that I make from my affiliate links to the Alzheimer's Society this month. So if you fancy doing some book shopping, you can donate to charity at the same time without any extra cost to you. Anyways, I would love to have a chat down in the comments. I hope you guys are doing well, and I will talk to you in my next video.